Manchester City have players who can do things with a football that shouldn't be possible. So do Real Madrid. So does Bayern Munich. So did Barcelona, for the better part of 15 years. And here's the thing almost nobody says out loud. The best football being played anywhere in the world right now is not being played by national teams. It's being played on a Tuesday night in the Champions League by club sides assembled from 6 different continents who train together every single day and have done for years. So if that's where the best football is, the most talented players, the most advanced systems, the sharpest coaching, why does the World Cup so often belong to someone else? Think about England's so-called golden generation. Gerrard, Lampard, Beckham, Terry, Cole, Owen, Rooney. At their peak, that group contained players who were winning Champions Leagues and Ballon d'Or nominations. By club standards, some of the best midfields in Europe. And yet together, for England, they never even reached a World Cup final. Not once. Belgium had their own version a decade later. De Bruyne, Hazard, Courtois, Lukaku, Kompany. A squad so stacked that pundits genuinely debated whether they were good enough to win the whole thing outright. Their best finish was a 3rd place. A great achievement, sure, but not what that collection of talent, on paper, should have produced. Argentina spent years being told the same story, that Messi, the greatest player most of us will ever see, simply hadn't been given a team good enough to win him a World Cup. And then, in 2022, almost the same group of players that had been not good enough for years suddenly were. And Brazil, the country that talks about football the way other countries talk about religion, has spent the last 2 decades arriving at World Cups with squads that look, on paper, like they shouldn't lose to anyone, and then, more often than people want to admit, losing anyway. So here's the question this video is actually about. If the best players in the world play together every week at the highest level football has ever reached, why does putting those same players into a national shirt so often produce something less than the sum of its parts? The answer isn't really about talent at all. It's about time, identity, and what it actually takes to turn a collection of brilliant individuals into something that functions as one organism under pressure. Let's get into it. There's a myth that football has never quite let go of. The myth says, if you put the best players in the world on the same pitch, you get the best team in the world. It feels like it should be true. It's almost insulting to suggest otherwise. Like saying that if you put the smartest people in a room together, they'd somehow produce worse ideas than a slightly less impressive group who'd worked together for years. But football has been quietly proving this myth wrong for decades, and the most famous example of all is Real Madrid's Galacticos. Between 2000 and 2006, Real Madrid assembled a collection of Ballon d'Or winners that, individually, might be the most decorated group of players ever to share a dressing room. Zidane, Figo, Ronaldo, the original one, Beckham, Raúl, Roberto Carlos. At various points, every single one of these players was either the best or among the 2 or 3 best players in their position on the planet. And in that period, despite that roster, Real Madrid won the Champions League once. Barcelona, with a squad that individually most people would have rated as less impressive on paper, went on to dominate Europe for years immediately afterward with a core built around academy players who'd grown up playing together since they were children. The Galacticos didn't fail because they lacked talent. They failed because a team isn't a sum, it's a structure. And you can't build a structure out of pieces that were each designed to be the centerpiece. Now hold that thought, because this is exactly the trap that national teams fall into. Except they don't even get the years that Real Madrid had to try and fix it. When England's golden generation is discussed, the conversation almost always focuses on individual quality. Could Gerrard and Lampard play together in central midfield? Maybe. But that's the wrong question. The real question is, did that group of players ever have the time, the system, or the shared footballing language to function as something more than 11 very good individuals standing in roughly the right positions? And the answer, mostly, was no. Not because the players weren't good enough, because nobody, not the players, not the coaches, not the federation, ever solved the structural problem. They kept trying to fit brilliant individuals into a shape, instead of building a shape that made those individuals brilliant together. This is the biggest myth in football, and it's the first piece of the puzzle. But it raises an obvious follow-up. Club teams have exactly the same problem. They also buy brilliant individuals and have to make them fit. So why do clubs solve it while national teams so often don't? The answer is the most basic resource in football, and the one international teams almost never have enough of: time. Here's a number that should change the way you think about international football completely. A top club manager, say someone at Manchester City, Bayern Munich, Liverpool, will typically have their squad together for around 300 days a year, training every day, multiple sessions some days, video analysis, set-piece routines repeated until they're instinctive, positional rotations drilled so often that players stop thinking about them and simply do them. A national team manager gets a fraction of that. International windows are a handful of days, scattered across the calendar, often arriving with players who've just played 60 minutes in a Champions League match 4 days earlier, are exhausted, slightly injured, and mentally still living inside their club's tactical system. Think about what that actually means in practice. Pep Guardiola can spend an entire preseason teaching Manchester City a new pressing trigger: when to step up, who covers behind, how the backline shifts as a unit, and then spend the next 6 months repeating it in training until it becomes muscle memory. A national team coach, in the same amount of real-world time, might get 2 friendlies in a training camp. That's it. That's the entire window to take players who've spent the whole season inside completely different systems, different pressing triggers, different spacing, different roles, and somehow get them speaking the same footballing language. This is why you'll sometimes watch a player for their country and think, that's not the player I watch every week. It's not that they've become worse. It's that they've been dropped into a structure that doesn't ask the same questions of them. And they haven't had anywhere near enough time to learn the new questions. And this is where the Belgium golden generation becomes such a fascinating case study. Almost every player in that squad was, individually, playing at an elite European club in a sophisticated tactical system week after week. But Belgium never had the time to build their own system, one that was specifically built around how those particular players, together, actually played. Instead, what often happened was a kind of compromise, a shape that tried to accommodate everyone's individual strengths without ever becoming a structure in its own right. And when a team doesn't have its own structure, it has nothing to fall back on when things go wrong. Individual brilliance has to cover for the gaps. And against the best teams, in knockout football, individual brilliance alone is rarely enough. So the time problem is real, and it's brutal. But it's not the whole story either, because if it were just about time, then international football would simply be a slightly weaker, slightly less polished version of club football. And anyone who's watched a World Cup knows that's not quite right. Something else changes too. The kind of football that wins becomes different. To understand why, we need to look at exactly how far ahead club football has pulled, and then understand why some of that progress doesn't transfer to international tournaments at all. If you want to see the absolute cutting edge of football tactics, you don't watch international football, you watch the Champions League. And the gap between the two has never been wider than it is right now. Take Manchester City under Pep Guardiola. The positional structure isn't just a formation, it's a set of rules so detailed that players will adjust their position by a couple of meters depending on which specific opponent is pressing them, and they'll do it without being told, because they've internalized it through years of repetition. Liverpool under Klopp built a pressing system so synchronized that it looked less like 11 players reacting to the ball and more like a single machine with 11 moving parts. The front 3 triggering the press, the midfield stepping up in sync, the backline moving as one unit to compress space. That doesn't happen by accident. That's the result of thousands of repetitions, video sessions, and a manager who had years, not days, to install it. Bayern Munich's rotations in midfield, Arsenal's rehearsed patterns from goal kicks, the way certain teams can switch from a back 4 to a back 3 during a match without anyone needing to be told. All of this is the product of daily repetition over years. It's not that international players don't understand these concepts. Of course they do. Many of them are the ones executing it for their clubs every week. The problem is that understanding a system intellectually and being able to execute it instinctively under pressure alongside 10 other players who've also internalized it, those are two completely different things. This is why international football often looks technically a half step slower and a half step less coordinated than the very best club football, even when it features many of the exact same players. It's not a lack of quality, it's a lack of shared automaticity. The players are all fluent, but they're not all fluent in the same dialect. So if club football has pulled so far ahead, more advanced pressing, more advanced positional structures, more rehearsed patterns than international teams could ever hope to replicate in a few weeks. You'd expect that gap to simply punish international football. And in a strange way, it does the opposite. Because the World Cup doesn't actually reward the team that plays the most advanced football. It rewards something else entirely, and that's where everything starts to flip. Here's the part of this story that explains almost everything else. The World Cup is not a different version of football, it's a different competition, with a different set of rules for what actually wins, even though the sport on the pitch looks the same. In a league season, if you have one bad week, a poor performance, an off day, a tactical misstep, you have 37 more games to make up for it. The season is forgiving. It rewards consistency over the long run, which is exactly the kind of advantage that the most sophisticated, well-drilled systems are built for. The World Cup gives you 7 games, and from the round of 16 onwards, every single one of them is knockout football, meaning one bad night, one refereeing decision, one moment of individual brilliance from an opponent, and your tournament, built over 4 years, is over. In that environment, the advantages that club football has spent years building, the rehearsed patterns, the positional automaticity, matter less than you'd think. What matters instead is something much harder to coach. Composure under existential pressure. The ability to not freeze when the entire weight of a nation's expectations lands on you in a single moment. This is also where national identity stops being a soft, sentimental idea and becomes something with real tactical consequences. When players represent their country, the stakes are different in a way that's almost impossible to replicate at club level, no matter how big the club. A player can lose a Champions League final and still be one of the best players at their club next season, lose a World Cup final, and that result can follow a player and a generation of players for the rest of their careers. That pressure can break teams that, on paper, look unstoppable. And it can also be the very thing that turns a team that looks ordinary on paper into something that becomes very difficult to beat, because they found a way to carry that pressure together instead of being crushed by it individually. So now we have 2 completely different sets of demands. Club football rewards the most advanced systems, repeated until automatic. The World Cup rewards composure, adaptability, and the speed at which a group of individuals can become something that feels like a team, fast. Which raises the obvious next question. If that's what actually wins the World Cup, not the most talented squad, not the most advanced tactics, but the team that becomes a team the fastest, then what does that actually look like in practice? Let's look at the teams that figured it out. Spain's 2010 World Cup win is usually remembered as the peak of tiki-taka, short passing, total possession, suffocating control of the ball. But the more interesting story isn't really about the passing style itself, it's about where that style came from. By 2010, the core of Spain's national team, Xavi, Iniesta, Busquets, Pedro, Piqué, plus several others, had spent years playing together at Barcelona under a manager whose entire footballing philosophy was built on exactly the kind of positional play we talked about earlier. These players didn't need years to build a shared footballing language for the national team. They already had one. They'd been speaking it every single day at club level. Spain didn't solve the time problem by getting more time. They solved it by recruiting a national team that had, in effect, already done the work somewhere else. The structure didn't need to be built from scratch in a training camp. It already existed, fully formed, in the muscle memory of half the squad. Germany 2014 is a slightly different version of the same idea, but with an extra layer. Germany's federation had spent over a decade, since their disappointing performance at Euro 2000, completely overhauling how the country developed young players. Every academy in the country was encouraged to play a similar possession-based style, with similar tactical principles, so that by the time players reached the national team, they'd been speaking a shared footballing language since they were teenagers. By 2014, Germany's national team wasn't 11 brilliant individuals trying to find common ground in a few weeks of training camp. It was a group of players who had been raised, almost literally, within the same tactical philosophy. The famous 7-1 semi-final destruction of Brazil wasn't really about individual brilliance overwhelming a weaker side. It was a fully formed system meeting a team that, by comparison, didn't have one. And the gap that the time problem usually closes during a tournament instead opened up catastrophically in real time in front of the host nation. And then there's Argentina 2022, which might be the most emotionally satisfying example of all, because it didn't follow either of those blueprints exactly. Argentina in 2022 wasn't a team built on a shared club system like Spain, and it wasn't the product of a decade-long footballing philosophy like Germany. What Argentina had was something different. A manager, Lionel Scaloni, who built the tournament around a settled, almost stubbornly consistent group of players over the 2 years leading into the World Cup. Long before the tournament started, Scaloni had already answered most of the structural questions: who plays where, who does what, how the team defends as a unit. By the time Qatar arrived, this wasn't a squad meeting each other's tactical habits for the first time. It was a team that had already become a team. And then, and this is the part that's almost too poetic, they lost their opening game to Saudi Arabia, a result that, for almost any other team, might have shattered exactly the kind of fragile cohesion we've been talking about this whole video. Instead, that loss seemed to do the opposite. It forced the team to confront the pressure immediately, together, with the entire tournament still ahead of them. And they came out the other side of it more unified, not less. Whatever was fragile about that group got tested in Game 1 instead of Game 7. And it held. 3 different routes. Spain imported a system. Germany built one from the ground up over a decade. Argentina built one quickly under a settled coach and then survived an early disaster that forged it further. But underneath all 3, the same idea is sitting there. None of them won because they had the most individually talented squad in the tournament. Although in Argentina's case, they arguably did. They won because by the time the tournament reached its most brutal moments, they had already become a team. The structure existed before the pressure arrived. So, what does that actually tell us about the tournament happening right now? Every World Cup gives us a live experiment in everything we've just talked about, and this one is no different. Look for the teams whose individual quality on paper looks overwhelming. The squads that, if you simply listed the clubs every player turns out for during the season, would look like a best 11 of European football. Then watch how those teams actually play in their opening fixtures. Are they fluent? Do they look like a structure or like a collection of very good players still working out where each other are going to be? Now look for the opposite. Teams that, on paper, look like they shouldn't be competitive with the genuine superpowers of world football, but who play with a clarity and a coordination that suggests they've spent real time together under a coach who has had the chance to build something specific. These are very often the teams that cause the upsets that define a tournament's opening rounds, not because they're suddenly better players than they were a week ago, but because their structure is already further along than their opponents. And keep an eye on something else: how teams respond after their first really difficult moment. A bad result, a player sent off, a goal conceded in the final minutes. Based on everything we've talked about, that first real crisis tells you almost as much about a team's chances as their opening performance does. Teams that have already become a team tend to respond to adversity by getting more organized, not less. Teams that are still a collection of individuals tend to fracture, visibly, sometimes within minutes, exactly when the cameras are watching closest. By the time this tournament reaches its semi-finals, the remaining teams will not necessarily be the 4 squads with the most individually decorated rosters. They'll very likely be 4 teams who, by whatever route, imported systems, long-term development, or a settled coach with enough time to do the work, arrived at this tournament already further along the journey from talented individuals to team than almost everyone else in the draw. That's the pattern. It's been the pattern for decades, and it'll almost certainly be the pattern again. So let's go back to where we started. The best football on the planet right now is being played by club teams. That part hasn't changed, and it isn't going to change. Manchester City, Real Madrid, Bayern Munich, and whichever club is next to push the boundaries of what's tactically possible will keep being the place where the sport itself is most advanced. But the World Cup has never really been a test of that. It never asks, who has the best footballers? It asks something much harder and much more human. Who can take a group of brilliant individuals, most of whom have spent the entire year being brilliant in completely different systems, for completely different clubs, under completely different pressures, and turn them into something that moves, thinks, and feels like one team in the tiny amount of time available, right when the pressure is at its absolute highest? England's golden generation never solved that. Belgium's golden generation never solved that. Brazil, again and again, has arrived with the talent to solve it and somehow not quite managed it. And Spain, Germany, and Argentina, in 3 completely different ways, did. So if you take one thing from this video, let it be this. The World Cup has never been won by the best collection of players. It's won by whoever becomes a team fastest. The fixture. Read the game.